Thank you for joining our Twitter space. TotalEnergies' latest financial results have been released today, and they tell one story: the continued profitability of fossil fuels. Yet communities living with the impacts of oil expansion are telling a completely different story. This conversation brings together project-affected people and civil society experts to examine the gap between corporate profits and community realities, and to ask who benefits, who pays, and what accountability looks like. To explore that question, we'll move from the global energy market to the experiences of communities in Uganda and Tanzania, and to the broader questions of policy, power, and accountability. Starting us off, we have our speakers, Rukiya Hamis from 350, Sherelee from Greenpeace, our own campaign coordinator, Zaki Mamdoo, and Ziada Kasim, who will be playing her recording, given that X or Twitter is banned in Tanzania. So kicking us off, Rukiya, so looking at TotalEnergies' profits today, what does this reveal about the relationship between fossil fuel companies, consumers, and our communities?
Thank you for setting up this space. I think it's a crucial space, especially today more than ever, as Total once again records massive profits on the backs of normal citizens and normal human beings across the world. As you know, if you've been checking out the news, the climate crisis or the symptoms of the climate crisis are getting more and more dire. We're seeing communities struggling to just literally just live, with massive fires in Canada, to floods in Ghana, to droughts in parts of northern Kenya, etc., etc. Yet the fossil fuel industry still has the best marketing strategy, because no matter what bad press that climate change is here and now, somehow they are invincible and are able to still manage massive profits. So a couple of months back, during the Q1 profits for Total, we realized that as a massive war in the Middle East was happening, Total and fossil fuel companies in different countries were still wrecking massive profits in the midst of a war that was affecting the whole world. And we saw that this showcased, so the out-of-pocket report that we worked on really showed how, climate, the climate change, but also just the cost of fossil fuels is trickling down to normal citizens. It was showing up in three ways. So one, the cost of fossil fuels was showing up in household pockets through taxes. So as governments are trying to cut, to subsidize the cost of fossil fuels and giving fossil fuel companies tax breaks, the normal human being or the normal citizen was incurring massive tax break that fossil fuels were experiencing. Secondly, we were also experiencing massive hikes in utility bills and retail prices. If you are in Kenya, you realize the price of milk was high, the price of bread was high, the price of just simple things that were accessible before went quite high. Yet, fossil fuel companies were still experiencing subsidies and could set the price as high as they'd like to. Thirdly, obviously, the damage on climate. As we continue to exploit fossil fuels, we will continue to exacerbate the impacts of climate change, and hence we'll see more droughts, more extreme heat, etc., etc. So this report really broke it down to us that it's not really about how much, but just how easy it is that fossil fuels can still run on the myth that they are the cheap fuel, right? Yet actually it's cheap for them, but it's expensive for the rest of us, the 99% that actually occupy this earth. So we looked at it deeper and tried to also pin down in terms of what about the impacts of it on the ground in East Africa. So we noticed that countries like Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, some of East African countries, a big chunk of East African countries, most of these countries are net oil importers, meaning we do not produce our own oil and buy it outside. So meaning we are consumers of fossil fuels and oil. Hence, the biggest market for fossil fuel companies, and that puts us in a very how do they say it, a weak position where we are the most affected whenever there are oil hikes, or global price shocks that are happening across oil, etc. And most of our industries, the small industries that really matters in our communities, from the transport industry to food sector to farming, are mostly affected due to high fossil fuel prices. So then I guess the question then comes to, so what do we do to really like counter this? And I know most of the other speakers will touch on this, especially the community reps that are here, and some of the other speakers, and especially Zaki, who's the coordinator of the EACOP campaign. But as communities, when we looked at the report, we realized that this Q2, they made massive profits again, and nothing has changed over the few months since April, and we're now in July. And that means this cycle of exploitation will continue to happen if we keep silent about how this industry is very exploitative, but also if we let public finance, which is the taxes we pay to our governments, be used for investments that do not make sense to our communities themselves. So it's so imperative that for us as communities and community leaders, civil societies, academia, to now pull into our own expertise and look inward in terms of, we cannot fight the big fight of the fossil fuel fight alone. We cannot fight it as just academia or just civil society. Now more than ever, we really need to pull in expertise and efforts across board. We need to bring people from economists who can counter the narrative that fossil fuel is cheap, to academia who can showcase and work with innovators to really showcase the power of renewable energy in the continent and the capacity that it has to transition our economies from fossil fuel reliant economies to economies that can actually be resilient past the age of the climate change. But also we need to work with, media and people and people who can help us amplify this message, because the fossil fuel industry has the best PR, although they do the worst things in the world. So we need to also back that with our own PR that showcases what is the solution that our communities actually want, what is actually possible in the communities that we work on, and what are the realities we live in the midst of the climate crisis. As our governments continue to invest alongside such cooperatives that really care about corporate greed and not really people first, we then have to stand in between that gap and fill that gap.
It seems we've lost Rukiya. So we will move on to the next speaker, who was the EACOP project affected person from Uganda, Balak Bakundane. Hopefully when Rukiya joins, she'll be able to complete her thought process. Balak, the floor is yours.
As you've heard, I'm called Balak Bakundane. I come from Ahoima, that's in the Albertine region of Uganda. The community that have been heavily impacted and negatively impacted by the TotalEnergies project and activities, most especially the East African crude oil project. And of course, today I'm not only speaking on my behalf as one of the project affected person, but also representing 100 of families who have struggled, who have suffered, and who have been impacted by TotalEnergies activity.
Have we also lost Balak?
Yes, indeed we have.
Yes, as I was saying that before these companies, most especially TotalEnergies itself, came into our communities, and as all other communities, most especially those ones in Uganda, these are the communities who lived in their respective communities very peacefully, and we entirely relying and depending on our land for livelihood, for income, and of course, even myself and many other young people there who were able to access education, to go to school because of our land, and our parents were effectively engaging in farming, where they produced coffee, produced the beans, maize, and that they were selling in the market such that they can raise school fees for us to be able to access the education, that we are able actually to engage in this kind of conversations. And of course, living in our tradition, respecting our culture, whereby communities were caring by one another, enjoying our good and fertile lands, enjoying our good environment, until we saw these companies coming into our communities, promising all sorts of good things, talking about the jobs, talking about the infrastructure, where they told us that they are going to uplift our livelihoods, that they are going to promote infrastructure within our communities and provide good education, health center services for our communities. And until later on, we realized that actually all these were very false promises and nothing up to date that has been able to materialize or to make any significant change within our lives as the EACOP host communities or impacted communities. And it is very, very, very unfortunate that the only legacy as project affected people can talk about the TotalEnergies. It is the suffering that we are going through today. The mothers who are no longer able to put food on the table for their children, and these are the people who are engaging in farming, that they could provide food for their families, they could get income from their farms, and they are able to send their children to school. They are able to get money to make sure that their children can access medical services. But as of today, it is a different story. And of course, all this started from the beginning, where they messed up with the process of land acquisition and the compensation process that has left very many households and communities landless. But now they can no longer actually engage in activities, engage in the farming that was supporting their livelihoods, that was supporting their families to live in harmony. Talking about the fishing communities, these ones who are entirely depending on the Lake Albert to be able to get food, to be able to get an income to support their household needs on every other day basis. But since these companies started coming into our communities, limiting the fishing community to access the lake, I can assure you that the suffering we are facing, the challenges that we are continuing to experience as communities that are actually living with the activities of TotalEnergies, it is unbearable. And I think it is something that is very, very painful to see that actually today TotalEnergies is bragging and announcing to the public on how they are making a lot of profits on the expense of the community suffering, on the expense of our community dignity, on the expense of our cultural values and dignity. It is very, very absurd to see today Total is announcing such kind of profits they are making. And of course, to me, when we talk about like TotalEnergies and the projects or developments that they are continuing to do within our communities, within our continent, I think it is a very, very, very clear indicator that this is a neo-colonial project that has no regard for our human rights, that has no regard for our cultural values, that has no regard for our livelihood. And I think that it should be condemned by everyone, not only actually that communities we are only looking at the TotalEnergies itself, but we are also wondering at the investors even financiers who are continuing to put their money in companies like Total that have continued to cause terrible problems within communities. And I think all we must do is to continue condemning these kind of actions, and also tell those investors that please, if you could come and see what is happening in our communities, I don't think that it should be anything that Total itself should be celebrating of today. It is very, very unfortunate and shameful. I think that's what I can talk about as a project affected person, all the challenges that we are continuing to experience on each and every other day because of these projects that have continued to displace our communities, that has continued to cause all these challenges. Thank you, and back to you, Abid.
Thank you, Balak, for that, for sharing with us your lived reality and what yourself and the communities that have been displaced or affected by the project in Uganda seem to be interpreting from what has been shared. If Rukiya is back, I would like for Rukiya to briefly finalize her point. Are you back, Rukiya, so that we could give you maybe 2 minutes to conclude?
Yes, Abid, can you hear me? So yeah, so like what I just say earlier was
I can hear you. Proceed.
So in April, Total recorded their first Q1 profits, and obviously they were high. It was still a massive profits, and this week, and especially today, as they report the second quarter, they actually record that they have grown. Their profits have increased around 105% since 2025, which is absurd considering how much the rest of the citizens have been struggling to just pay for simple fuel to fuel your car, or for simple boda rider to be able to purchase fuel to be able to run his family, etc., etc. So then I wanted to just connect this to just the overall global dynamic is that oil majors still operate on global commodity pricing models. And so this, although we've seen the wars that happen, the Middle East war that was happening early this year, and there's still issues around that. And yet we've seen also the global climate change impacts that we've been noticing across the continent and as well as the world. Like I think recently in the social media, you've been seeing the forest fires in Canada. You've been seeing the floods in Ghana last month in June, et cetera, et cetera. Yet fossil fuel companies are still able to rake profits without any, how do I say this? There's some sort of immunity to them that they can continue to impact and the climate and as well the environment, and cause detrimental impacts to communities and families and households and just the environment as itself. Yet there is some immunity that they carry in our continent and in our regions. So then I see that this is a sign that now more than ever that there needs to be a global way forward, an agreement across the world and the continent especially, on how we need to really set the tone to take away the power that fossil fuel companies such as Total continue to have in our communities. And this is where campaigns such as the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, the Stop EACOP campaign come in, because they highlight such human rights violations. I think Balak has spoken quite adequately on this. And if we continue to have such watchdogs across our communities, and that means we cannot continue to see this impunity go through. But unfortunately, it feels sometimes that this work is still heavy and there's still a lot of work to be done, because if you're noticing right now in Kenya with the recent oil refinery that's coming in Lamu, after Lamu just won against a coal-fired power plant, there's this massive appetite for fossil fuels, massive appetite for for oil, gas, coal, all of a sudden there's this rush for gas and oil. Just because a big chunk of East African countries are net importers of oil and gas doesn't mean now for us, it means we need to now constantly still feel like we need to rely on fossil fuels as the next best option. I feel it's an opportunity and a moment for the continent, especially East Africa itself, to really hone in into figuring out what's the next best solution for us and how can we pick the right investors for our communities and for our continent. And for the investors that have already been accepted and the communities that are already struggling, how can we make sure that there are reparations to those communities so that we cannot let such companies as Total and the rest to continue to exploit our communities, take dignity out of communities without having any consequences to that. So that's mostly what I wanted to just wrap up with. And I want to pass it back to you, Abid. Thanks.
Bear with me. There seems to be like about 10 seconds delay. I'm going to play an audio from Ziada, who unfortunately, for those who don't know, Tanzania banned X or Twitter since the elections. And so they are having challenges joining, but he was gracious enough to record something for us to listen to at this particular point that I'm going to just cue now. Sorry, are you saying you cannot hear the recording?
No, we can't come.
Okay, I think as we saw that out, let me invite Sherelee from Greenpeace. So Sherelee, how does the debate around windfall profits, tax incentives, and corporate accountability help us understand this wider question?
Okay, thanks, Abiyad, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible, but just to understand a bit on the windfall profits and what they actually are. So they are profits that companies make due to like extraordinary events beyond their own efforts. So an event like, geopolitical instability such as the war. So the recent conflict in with the war on Iran and heightened tensions in the Middle East, it created these fears of disruption to the global oil supplies, and then that caused the oil prices to rise. And as a result, the major IOCs, the international oil companies like TotalEnergies, they benefited from the higher oil prices without actually putting in the effort. So without actually producing more oil or becoming more efficient or anything like that. They just earned more revenue because of the market price of oil increased. And the profits that Total put up today, it highlighted the injustice of the fossil fuel industry, essentially because as it was mentioned that there was a over 100% increase as compared to the same period last year, and that's driven by higher oil prices. And the irony is that while these oil companies enjoy the unexpected gains and profits, ordinary people experience the opposites, what Rukana mentioned, higher fuel prices and energy prices, the cost of living. And then also it's, communities, bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, of the costs of floods and droughts and heat waves and pollution. And this raises now that fundamental question of who actually benefits from these fossil fuel developments in Africa. The developments that they say that will bring Africa out of energy poverty or, increase our economic development or whatever else false narrative they bring in to bring in these developments in Africa. And the issue around EACOP, it reflects this imbalance that while these multinational oil companies earn the substantial profits, communities that live alongside these developments, bear the risks of displacement and environmental degradation and their loss of livelihoods and the climate impacts. And at the same time, governments also provide generous tax incentives and concessions to attract these investments. So the public may receive less revenue while assuming the greater environmental and social costs. So this is why we're actually calling out governments to essentially make polluters pay, and this is based on the polluters pay principle, that these companies that are generating enormous profits from fossil fuels should not be allowed to privatize the gains while socializing the costs. So that extraordinary windfall profits that they make and beyond should contribute to essentially funding the climate crisis. So loss and damage, just disaster recovery, adaptation. The compensation should support these affected communities in need instead of leaving taxpayers and vulnerable communities to shoulder the burden of the climate crisis. Now, this is not a get out of jail free card for the IOCs like TotalEnergies and the other big ones, because we still are in a climate crisis due to the burning of fossil fuels. So we need to transition to cleaner energy. And that's what corporate accountability is about ensuring that companies are responsible not only to their shareholders, but also to the people and the ecosystems affected by their operations. So a fair coordinated windfall profits tax is one of the ways to help finance the just transition to renewable energy, to also strengthen the resilience of climate impacts and support communities already paying the price for that. Ultimately, the question is not whether Africa should pursue development. Yes, we should, but development that is sustainable, development that creates permanent jobs for locals, that does not harm the ecosystem and the communities that rely on it for a livelihood. So, we have to ask from these developments is who carries the risks, who pays when things go wrong, and making polluters pay is about correcting that imbalance and ensuring that those who profit the most from it, the fossil fuel companies, contribute to repairing the damage that they've caused. Thank you. Back to you, Abiad.
Thank you for that take, Sherelee. I think I'm just going to straight move to play the recording from Ziada. Again, I'm just repeating that in Tanzania, they've banned X. And so our guest was not able to join on time. So we're just going to play her recording right now.
The way to understand is that behind every financial headline about the EACOP, the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, are real people who used to live in this alongside these areas have been profoundly affected with this project, and they really rarely tell the story of women who have lost their reliable source of income, farmers facing uncertainty about their land, youth, young people concerned about their future, fishing community worried about changes to the environment that they depend on. Many families have told us that the land is far from that property. And it is their source of food, the land is the source of food, the income, identity, and the security within their life. So when the access to land change or livelihood are disrupted, the effect is extend beyond household income. Family may struggle to plan for the future, support their children's education, or maintain the social network that hold these communities together. But we also have communities in the north part of Tanzania, in Manyara. We've met the women described on how the access to land and natural resources is close and linked to their abilities that it provides for their families. And many of them rely on farming, collecting forestry products like honey, fruits, and small businesses that connected to the local ecosystem. They shared the concern that change associated with large-scale development that have been increased uncertainty about their livelihood and reduced opportunity to earn stable income. And these women have shared that they have already faced barrier to land ownership and financial resources, but also often experience the pressure most acutely. Um, but we have been able to publish the article that is already have these stories under the 350 OG globally. So everyone maybe after this can go and through check about the stories the loader and how women have been impacted about this project and how their life is connected to land and how the large scale development are now impacting, continually depressing their life. And but also we have communities in Singida. This community, they always share about the anxiety over the future, especially for their farm and the grazing family. And in Singida, many of them are pastoralist community, so they depend on unpredictable access to land and water. So any disruption can affect harvest, but also livestock, income, and food security, as we all know. And the impact, they are not only impacting them with the issue of economic, but it also impacts the people's well-being, resilience, and all that. But this is all about EACOP has been crossed alongside 8 regions. So we have been able to meet as many regions and villages as we can. And we also have the fishing community, as I mentioned earlier, Tanga region. Tanga is also the community that has been impacted. And Tanga, it's a region alongside the Indian Ocean. So this community in Tanga, many of them depend on fishing. So this is the fishing community. But also they do small scale agriculture, but they do like a healthy coastal ecosystem. They do have that. So this community, they want the development that create opportunity, but also protecting the natural resource that they use to depend on all their livelihood. The community members, they still tell us that they need a meaningful involvement in decision making that affect their life and to have access and clear and timely information. Speaking about the decision making, at first when this project came, it's called a misleading on the issue of decision making. Not all community were involved on the issue of decision making. So we found a large number of community, especially women, who were speaking about why didn't them include in the issue of decision making. So by now they need an inclusive decision that will support their community, their life, their dignity, and resilience as well, because you can't be resilient for things you don't know. So they need to be included in decision making. So if they accept to be resilient on it, they can do that. So when we speak about accountability for the about the communities they asking about their life more than the promise that TotalEnergies gave to them. So we need Total to understand their accountability should not rely on them, the promise that they gave. We need more than that. We need a meaningful participation of the community in decision making, because that is the thing that misleaded at first from the beginning. We now need meaningful decision making and participation of the community before, from now, during, and even the project was going to be started and implemented. So we also need transparent information that is fair and timely, not that they're announcing about the profit. This profit is only for them, but TotalEnergies and EACOP. It's not the profit for the community. So we also need transparent information and fair information that if they're getting information, if they're getting profit, what about the community profit? So we need a fair information about that. But also timely processes where livelihoods that are affected, effective to environmental protection, but also access to the social livelihood and needs. But also we need independent monitoring that community can start or can trust. So we need the monitoring processes that community have been involved and the community have access to that monitoring, because this is our land, this is our community. How can someone from nowhere, someone somewhere came and start to monitor the thing that we have? No, we should be at the forefront as the community. We accept development, but we cannot accept to be controlled in our community, in our ancestors' land, to be controlled with someone from somewhere. So we need an independent monitoring that we trust as a community. But also, I and the community and the Green Conservers and other partners in Tanzania, like OCE, Greenpeace, above all, we need the voices that to be treated as an essential part of development. Not only the people behind their back. We need to be part of this essential development, because at the end of the day, we are the one who are going to believe with this project. So we need their voice to be heard. We need our voice to be mattered and be treated as a part of development. But also, the world should understand on the issue of climate justice and social justice. It's about people, not development only. So they should develop, the development should improve life.
Apologies for that. The recording ended abruptly, but I think we've gotten the gist of what Ziada was explaining to us. Again, facing lots of challenges today. In part, for those who just joined, we were listening to the recording of Ziada from Green Conservers of the challenges that the Tanzanians are facing as far as those are the communities living along the East African crude oil pipeline. And I would like now to note here, even before I introduce our next speaker, that what Ziada says, and compared to, and in addition to what Balak Bakundani shared from Uganda, there's a clear contrast. Oil companies benefit enormously, while many households get squeezed. In East Africa, communities affected by EACOP are asking who benefits from the project and who carries the risks. So I'm going to hand over to our campaign coordinator, Zaki. Today's financial results announcement shows just how much money fossil fuel companies are making. But as communities affected by EACOP have told us, that money isn't shared equally. So what does this moment tell us about accountability? And what does that even look like going forward? Zaki.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Comrade Abiud, and thank you for setting up the space to mark the occasion of Total announcing yet another round of record profits. And of course, thank you to all the speakers who came in before and for the clarity of perspective offered by everyone, Comrade Rukiya, Comrade Sherelee, Comrade Ziada, Comrade Balak Bakundani. Look, for me, and I'm going to try and be brief, but I think the critical point to draw out for me is that when we hear that Total has made $6 billion in profit in just 3 months, which is roughly 68% higher than what they made in the same period last year, the first question that we are confronted by and that we should ask is, where does that money actually come from? Because by all means, it was not created by executives sitting in boardrooms under nice air conditioning and in fancy leather chairs, nor was that money pulled out of thin air. It wasn't pulled from nothing. But profit is indeed the portion of wealth produced by workers that they themselves do not receive back in wages, right? So Total's workers produce, they extract, they transport, they refine, and they sell far more value than they are paid for. The difference in that value that is sold is then taken by the company, and it is distributed upwards to its executives and to shareholders, and that is the essence of their profits, right? But even that does not capture the full picture, because Total's profits also depend on pushing enormous costs onto everyone else, right? So communities, as we've seen in the case of EACOP, they lose. Communities lose their livelihoods, workers carry the risks of production, the general public carries the cost of pollution, of climate destruction, and of social breakdown. And in most cases across almost all capitalist countries in the neo-colonial world, the public also carries the cost of guaranteeing profits to private companies through, public-private partnerships and these sorts of deals and arrangements. And of course, like comrades have correctly pointed out, the public also carries the cost of geopolitical tensions and of war, the cost of living crisis, of course, that we are confronted by skyrockets in our fuel prices, in the prices of our food, and all manner of other things, all while Total keeps the revenue. And ordinary people, in very real ways, in very real terms, made to pay the real price. Of that. And we see this very clearly, comrades, along the route of the East African crude oil pipeline. Of course, while executives and shareholders celebrate what is for them another profitable quarter, affected communities, as we have heard, continue to confront the harsh conditions brought about by land loss, inadequate compensation, the destruction and unraveling of their livelihoods, and in turn, food insecurity and all of the kind of social ills and conditions that flow from it. And indeed, also confronting conditions of increased militarization and surveillance and repression. Where families that once had survived from their land have been left far more vulnerable and far more dependent, in some cases, even forced and pushed into the formal economy, or at least to compete for jobs, limited and sparse jobs within the formal economy, where previously families would have been able to keep a roof over their head and put food on the table. And of course, we see, organizers, students, community leaders, all, kinds of activists and ordinary people who have challenged the EACOP project have faced all kinds of intimidation, surveillance, arrest, detention, for incredibly lengthy periods as well. But the point I'm making is that these profits are not a neutral business achievement, and it's important that we understand that point. They are not neutral. They are, if anything, an account of organized exploitation, though of course organized exploitation is entirely legal under capitalism, but still it is effectively an admission of robbery when a company like Total announces record profits of this nature. Those profit margins tell us how successful Total has been in converting the labor of workers, converting community land, public resources, and environmental destruction into private wealth that it shares amongst its executives and its shareholders. And I think that's, for me, the most politically useful and important point to put across in the context of these record profits being announced by Total today in the form of the 6 billion USD for quarter two. But to conclude, and to your question, Abiud, on the question of the Stop EACOP campaign, the question of accountability, and really, I think what the near completion of the East African crude oil pipeline means for us, we quite simply reject the idea that just because construction has advanced, that the struggle is somehow over. I mean, EACOP's own proponents, of course, now report that the pipeline is around 88% complete. But importantly for us is our assertion that construction does not erase responsibility. In fact, the corporation does not escape accountability simply because the damage has already been inflicted or because a project becomes operational. It is the opposite. It, if anything, makes the accountability phase of the campaign even more important. And so we will continue, of course, in our work in supporting communities, fighting for remedy, for compensation and for justice. We'll continue documenting the project's impacts and challenging attempts to rewrite the experience of affected people. Continue pursuing legal and regulatory avenues, confronting the financiers and the investors who are enabling Total, and of course exposing the gap between the company's public promises and the reality of ordinary people on the ground. In addition to that, and at the risk of sounding somewhat contradictory, I think we must also challenge the narrative of inevitability here, because Total does want people to believe that once sufficient money has been invested and enough construction has taken place, that resistance then becomes pointless. But of course, we know that projects remain vulnerable to public scrutiny, to legal action, to financial pressure, to political opposition, and of course, and centrally, to organized community resistance, throughout the lifespan and existence of that project. And our struggle has always been about more than stopping one pipeline. It is also about challenging a model of so-called development in which corporations extract wealth from Africa, where governments protect the investments of those corporations and further the interests of capital generally, and communities are then expected to accept dispossession and precarity and poverty, simply so that Total shareholders can rejoice as they are in their record profits. We of course also know and have maintained that the EACOP is designed to open up the entirety of the East African region to exploration and exploitation. And of course, we're already beginning to see that take shape in different ways and different forms. And so it is, of course, in our interest to escalate the fight against all of the associated projects and the parasitic expansion of oil extraction in East Africa in general. And so, not to belabor the point, but to move towards conclusion, I would simply like to invite, journalists, researchers, policymakers, and everyone who is listening to look beyond the headline figure of Total's record profits. We need to be asking who produced that wealth, who is receiving that wealth. We need to ask who has been forced to bear the cost of the production of that wealth. And the answers, I think, are quite striking when we follow the experiences of affected communities in the case of the East African crude oil pipeline, and when we scrutinize Total's claims and continue asking the questions that the company otherwise would prefer are simply left to be forgotten. And so while Total's profits may dominate the business headlines today, it is our responsibility to make sure that the workers and communities whose exploitation made those profits possible are not written out of the story. In fact, they sit at the very heart of it. And that really is our contention here today. Thank you very much. And back to you, Comrade Abiud.
Thank you so much, Zaki, for helping us connect the dots and reminding us that accountability doesn't end as these projects advance. If anything, moments like today's earnings announcement make accountability even more important, like you've said. We've heard about the global picture from Rukiya and 350 team. We've heard directly from communities in Uganda and Tanzania, and we've reflected on what these profits mean beyond the balance sheet, as Sherelee took us through why polluters should pay. We'd now like to open the floor, and I would want to give priority to, maybe if there's a journalist around, would give you priority, but otherwise we're going to open up to everybody and every member of the public who's joined us. We'd love to hear your questions or reflections, and please request to speak, and we'll do our best to bring in as many voices as time allows. Any questions, reflections, something that any of our speakers say that you'd want clarification on? All right, I'm not seeing any from my end. Okay, that could mean one thing or two things. Either that it was a very complicated conversation, or that everything was very clear. So as we wrap up today's conversation, I'd like to thank all our speakers, everyone who joined us, and those who helped amplify this discussion. Once again, we would repeat that accountability is not a one-day conversation. It requires continued public scrutiny, responsible journalism, meaningful engagement from companies, governments, financiers, and civil society alike. Thank you for joining us. If you found today's discussion valuable, please share the recording with your networks and continue following the work of this topic of campaign and our coalition partners. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for being part of this important conversation.